All right, so welcome. You are attending the tax section CLE called Navigating Burnout and High Conflict People for Professionals. We are joined today by Jenna Watson, who's going to share professional insights into the psychological aspect of burnout and navigating high conflict individuals. And its potential effects on physical and mental well-being and how to combat those effects with self-care and resilience-building exercises. Our CLE code today is 8204. Again, that's 8204, and I will provide it again at the end of the presentation and maybe just before we start it. My name is Jennifer Migliori. I'm the Assistant Director of the Education Committee of the tax section of the Florida Bar. And if you have any ideas for a great tax presentation, tax CLE topic, please reach out to me. I can be reached at jmigliori@dwaynemorris.com, and I will drop that into the chat box and once we get started. I would like to take this opportunity to share upcoming information with the tax section of the Florida Bar. Our next free tax section CLE will be presented by Mark Brown and Christopher Weig of Commodore Singer Baseman, and they're going to be covering highlights of the 58th Annual Heckerling Estate Planning Institute in Orlando that happened earlier this month. And there will be important estate planning and tax updates that affect your practice. So you want to be sure to visit us for that. On March 13th, tentatively, we intend to cover a topic, a corporate tax topic, taught by Adam Smith. And on March 9th through 7th, the tax section is having the annual tax moot court competition live at Stenson University College of Law. And on May 2nd through May 5th, the tax section will have its annual meeting at Atlantis Paradise Island in the Bahamas. I believe registration is open. If not, it will be very soon. I'm excited to present our sponsor for today. He joins us from Senior Counsel Attorneys at Law, Mike Jorgensen. Welcome, and thank you for sponsoring our CLE today.
Thank you very much, and you got my name perfect. Couldn't ask for better. Anyway, my name is Mike Jorgensen, and I am the managing partner of Senior Counsel Attorneys at Law. We are a small boutique elder law firm in the Riverside, Jacksonville area. I was so happy when the sponsorship became available. I've been a member of the tax section since 1986. Some of you may remember me from Amelia Island. For 33 years, Ian White and I have been hosting the hospitality suite at Amelia Island July meeting. Now today, even though I'm still a member of the tax section, I primarily practice in elder law. I still do some tax controversy work. But the reason this topic is so important to me is because as an elder law attorney, we deal a lot with caregivers who are primarily dealing with the elderly. Sometimes they're dealing with adult special needs children. So we see the effects of caregiver stress and burnout. When the tax section needed a sponsor, we wanted to host this CLE so that we could help educate our members about burnout and crisis prevention. I believe that we will learn some very good tips today that will help us in our personal lives and as well as our practices. I appreciate the tax section putting this continuing legal education program on, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for your generous sponsorship of this CLE. We're happy to have you. It is my pleasure to introduce Jenna Watson. I did want to provide a little information about her background. I was so impressed by reading through it that I just wanted to share as much information as possible as regarding Jenna's background. Jenna is a licensed mental health therapist in private practice, known for her expertise in supporting companies in their efforts to create environments that support mental well-being. In addition to her successful career in scaling and leading startups and Fortune 500 companies, she's dedicated her professional journey to helping executives navigate challenges of burnout and providing them with valuable education and support. She works closely with organizations to develop comprehensive programs aimed at educating employees on burnout, fostering resilience, and promoting self-care. And Jenna's commitment to enhancing well-being of professionals extends beyond her private practice. She's a certified grief recovery specialist and certified mental health neutral for collaborative divorces. So that's important for us who practice in that area. Her extensive training in trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy allows her to provide compassionate care to individuals facing complex emotional challenges. She holds 2 Masters of Arts degrees in clinical psychology from Pepperdine University and has received specialized training from Postpartum Support International, enabling her to offer essential support to those dealing with infertility, adoption, prenatal mood disorders. Her dedication to her profession and remarkable achievements have garnered attention, being featured in publications such as the New York Times, Forbes magazine, the LA Times, the Orlando Business Journal. Jenna currently resides in Orlando, Florida with her 2 children who serve as constant motivation to create positive change in the life of others. Jenna, we are so excited to have you join us here today. And without further ado, I will shift the mic back over to you. Just one more comment, actually. If anybody has any questions, please place your questions in the chat box and we will aim to address them as appropriate. Jenna, thank you for your presentation. We're very excited.
Are we good on the screen, Jennifer? Can everybody see it?
I see your screen and it's
Wonderful.
Full screen, so we're ready.
Thank you so much. Well, first and foremost, thank you to Jennifer and the entire tax law section of the Florida Bar. I'm incredibly excited to be here. This is a passion of mine to talk about burnout and how to combat it. We see the effects not only physically, but mentally and emotionally too. And burnout can come from a wide variety of sources. As Mike mentioned, I'm incredibly passionate about caregiver support because we do see individuals who are caregivers, whether they're caring for the elder parents. I work very closely with what I call the sandwich generation, where they will be taking care of their aging parents and their children, or somebody who has a disability. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into burnout. And then I'm also going to take you through how to spot, a high conflict individual, not only professionally, but personally, and then how to navigate that kind of personality, and then also how to communicate effectively with them. So the definition that I like to use as far as what burnout is when everything feels like too much, but nothing ever feels like enough. The clinical interpretation of it is it's a state of emotional, mental, and also physical exhaustion, prolonged and repeated stress. That can look like a host of things. I often see clinically people coming in thinking that they have depression or anxiety, when oftentimes it's just burnout, and what they need to do is kind of redefine how they're approaching their life. Some of the symptoms of burnout include inability to complete basic tasks. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by folding the laundry or doing the dishes, responding to an email, that might be a symptom of burnout. Frequent illness. I oftentimes see individuals come into my practice who are complaining of repeat strep throat. They have frequent colds, sore throats, ulcers. I like to say that our intuition whispers and then our body screams when we need a break. Isolation. So one of the symptoms is maybe not feeling like hanging out with family or friends or making a dinner. You find yourself staying at home more. You're not responding to text. You're not calling your support system. Lack of motivation. Maybe at one point you were really motivated to work out, or you felt incredibly passionate about what you were doing at work. But what you'll notice is you start micro self-sabotaging. So that looks like you once got to the office at 8 a.m. Now it's 8:15. Next thing you know, it's 8:30. Next thing you know, it's 9 a.m. That can actually be a symptom of burnout. Procrastination. You've got a deadline. You knew about it for a week. You're 45 minutes before that deadline and you start working on the project. That's definitely a symptom. Like I mentioned as well, feelings of overwhelm, just emotional overwhelm, mental overwhelm. That can include brain fog. That can include forgetfulness. It can, you forget what you're saying, just like I am now. Those are definitely symptoms of burnout. One of the ones that I see often, because I do work with high achievers, I call it my do-it-all type A high achiever crowd, is insomnia. And I have a thing that I like to call it, it's their witching hour. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., they're waking up and they're going through their to-do list and what they have to do at the office the next day. And maybe their child has a swim meet, or maybe they need to make that vet appointment for their dog, but they're kind of running through their tasks and to-do list and they're hamster wheeling at night. That is definitely a sign that you're either there or you're on your way. So causes of burnout. The number one thing that I hear that's inaccurate is, well, I have too much to do. Of course, I'm going to get burnt out if I'm working 8, 10, 12-hour days, but that's not actually it at all. The number one cause of burnout is poor boundaries. So when I talk about boundaries, which is a very popular topic right now in clinical psychology, I don't just mean boundaries as far as like communication boundaries. There are time boundaries, there are physical boundaries, there are mental boundaries. So for example, a time boundary, and everybody's is unique and different. There's not a one size fits all, but a time boundary would look like, I am responding to emails after hours. I am being incredibly responsive to text messages that don't need my attention right now. So when you're turned on all the time and you're available to all people and you're firing on all cylinders at all times, the reality of that is it is going to eventually lead to burnout. One thing that I see, and again, going back to what Mike mentioned about caregivers, is this overdeveloped sense of responsibility. I say oftentimes to my clients, you've got a lot going out, but you have almost nothing coming in for you. So those are my yes people. They say yes to more projects that they don't have the bandwidth for. They say yes to being, the parent who brings all the snacks to the different events for their kids. They also are my people pleasers. I like to say, people pleasing really isn't about people pleasing. It's about keeping you out of the emotional discomfort of having to say no and passing judgment on yourself and fear of judgment from others. So again, you're overcommitted, right? Other directedness, again, going back to the work that Mike does. When you are a caregiver, when you are in a high profile profession, oftentimes the work you do is other directedness. So it's not like you can necessarily turn that off when you're in any of those roles, but you have to recognize kind of where you sit. It's the acknowledgement and the insight into, what a lot of what I do is really being focused on others. So I have to sit there and kind of think, well, if I've got, again, a lot going out, what do I have coming in? Another area that causes burnout is lack of support. So when we talk about support, there are fundamentally different areas of support we kind of take a look at. Lack of support could be having appropriate staffing at work, right? You're down an individual in your department. If that is something that happens for far too long, that can be a cause of burnout because you're, again, taking on more work than you can actually handle. One thing when I look at support, especially professionally, I love to tell individuals that capacity is not capability. So what happens with individuals who get burnt out is they have this overdeveloped sense of responsibility, personally and professionally. And part of that comes from they feel like if they say no, if they raise their hand and talk about needing the additional support of individuals around them, that somehow is a statement and a testament to their capability. But really, it's not. It's a statement and a testament to their capacity. And that is something incredibly important to know about burnout. Another area that I often see is unresolved pain and trauma from the past. One thing that often leads to burnout is somebody might have unresolved grief. Maybe they had, a loss of an elder parent. Maybe a pet recently passed away. And they think, okay, well, that's in my past. But if you're not dealing with it, it will eventually come up and come out. And it can in the form of burnout. A couple other areas that I look at is uncertainty. Uncertainty can be a cause. Actually, there's kind of a trifecta that typically happens here with burnout. It's uncertainty. So you have no idea what's coming next, right? There's no light at the end of the tunnel for a project, what's going on at home, lack of information. We can all only work within the framework of what we know. So for example, if you're working on a project at work and there is sparse information, that is going to be a stressor that you are carrying that you can only carry for so long. And then absence of control. If you feel like you do not have control over areas of your life, you will definitely hit a place of burnout. So that's the biggest thing that I typically let individuals know is that if you are sitting in a space and say you're not burnt out right now, right? You're feeling good. You're feeling competent. You've got the capacity to take on more, kind of tackle life. What you really want to be mindful of is that trifecta. Do you feel like you have some level of control over your work, profession, over your home life? Do you feel like you have the information that you need to be successful and competent in whatever you're trying to accomplish or achieve? And is there some level of certainty in what you're doing and what's next for you? So if you're sitting here listening to this today and you're going, I don't really feel like I have control in any area of my life. I don't have that information and I have no certainty about, what's going to happen to me in February. That's something you may want to take a look at and look for kind of the bright spots in your life of what is within your control, what is certain, and what kind of information, because knowing that can keep you out of the burnout versus looking back and going, oh, I've arrived here today because I sat in those 3 areas for far too long. Okay, the art of overcoming burnout. There are a couple of different ways to do that, but one of the things that I often talk about is the redefinition of self-care, right? So most of us have probably heard at some point, oh, you're feeling burnt out. Well, just self-care, right? And I hear it all the time. People come in and they're like, well, I've been meditating and I've been writing in my journal and I've been doing yoga. And I oftentimes ask, well, how's that working out for you? And they're like, it's not working well at all. And it's not working because what they're doing is they're adding to their to-do list versus taking away. So that's really important to know because there is a redefinition of self-care that I'm looking at from a clinical interpretation. So, people will go, well, I go home and I have a glass of wine every night to wind down. I will tell you, this is a very unpopular opinion, but wine is not self-care, it is coping. They're like, I'm doing the pedicures, I'm taking the bubble baths, but the reality of that is not something that will sustain you and pull you out of a phase of burnout. So a couple of things that I like to take a look at is when we're combating burnout, before we arrive, or even if we're having to pull ourselves out of it, we need to create a self-care routine that's authentic and sustainable. So what does that actually look like and sound like? It's pretty boring and mundane, to be honest. It looks like simplifying your life because you're already sitting there. You feel like you're mentally, emotionally drowning. The last thing that you need to do is go home and make a 5-course meal, right? And people, I'll be talking to people and they're like, oh, but I really enjoy that. So we'll get to that at some point. But simplifying looks like looking at your week and actually planning your meals and going, there's nothing wrong with Taco Tuesday, right? If you need to have a Taco Tuesday for the rest of the year, I give you complete permission to do that, because what is happening when you simplify, when you go, you know what, Mondays, this is going to be the cuisine for dinner. And then Tuesdays is Taco Tuesday. And then, Fridays is pizza night. You are offloading some of the mental load that you're carrying that typically leads to burnout. So that's like an example of what a sustainable, authentic self-care measure would look like. One thing I often hear is, I don't have time to work out, because a lot of therapists like to be like, oh, just go to the gym, it'll make you feel better. And while movement definitely benefits our mental and emotional well-being, it's about movement. It's not about going to the gym, doing a HIIT workout, getting on the Peloton. It is about actively moving your body for 10 minutes a day. And that can look as simplistic as stretching, but it needs to be consistent. Another area that I like to talk about is planning for the I'm too busy. Once you're drowning, you're drowning. And the reality of the situation is that even if you are not drowning, but you're listening to this today and you're like, oh, I know somebody who is, and I want to go support them. A drowning person will drown you as well. So you have to get ahead of it and plan for the I'm too busy. That can look like doing a brain dump, at the end of the day or the beginning of the day to get ahead of what is coming. That can also look like weekly planning, monthly planning, just a checks and a balances to kind of assess what's coming. Because, for example, if there is a wave, a big wave coming, at the beach, if you're sitting there and you're looking at it coming, you can get to shore, right? But if you've got your back turned to it and you're pretending that that big wave is not going to happen, it's going to take you down and under. So there is benefit to going ahead and planning for those too busy moments. Acceptance for what currently is. So this is a huge one. Oftentimes what happens is we will avoid and resist what stresses we're having, and we're pretending like they're not actually happening to us when they are. When you're looking at, gosh, I have a 12-hour day. Oftentimes it's like, I'm going to avoid the fact that I have a 12-hour day and pretend that that's not actually happening. But when you sit there and you go, okay, this is my day and this is where I'm at and this is what I have to work with, that can be potentially freeing, because what you're doing is you're not sitting in guilt and shame of feeling like you should be able to handle it or you should be doing more, right? Once we get into the should statements, there is no acceptance in that. So acceptance for what currently is can sometimes sound like two things. One, giving yourself permission to recognize that things are hard. Mike mentioned kind of that elder care and working with caregivers. And what I often see is that people don't want to accept they're hard, because they feel like by saying that something's really hard or difficult or that they're struggling and they don't admit it, that it's going to go away. Or they feel like if they say, you know what, this is really difficult and really hard, that there is some level of weakness. But in being able to accept what is, it can be incredibly relieving. One of the biggest areas that I look at, and my favorite, and I'll get to it on the next slide, is I call it empathetic discernment. How do you invest your time, energy, and emotions, right? Again, lots going out, little coming in, but where is that going? So I use the analogy of a bag of M&Ms to kind of demonstrate empathetic discernment. So we all start off our day with a bag of M&Ms, and hopefully everybody is an M&M lover on this, but if not, pick Skittles or pick, another candy. And so we're going through our day. We start out and, maybe a client is requesting that, they come in, you get on a call and they're like, oh, I love M&Ms. Can I have one? Maybe your children are requesting M&Ms, right? They're like, oh, I love M&Ms. So you're giving M&Ms to your kids, a spouse, or, a partner. I'm giving my partner a couple M&Ms. By the end of the day, you're like, wow, I love M&Ms. It's something that, I want to enjoy. And you look in your bag and there are no M&Ms left. Well, the M&Ms are the metaphor for time, right? We typically high achievers, type A's, the folks on this presentation are time poor. And it's about managing the time, the emotional energy, the mental energy, and the time required in order to get through your day and actually have M&Ms for yourself. And this is what that looks like. It's a very unique idea, and it's something that's fairly new. Again, right? People talk about burnout and they'll be like, oh, well, work less and you'll be fine, or, take more naps. But what I see through the lens of psychology is it's very different, right? It's about the output of our emotional and mental energy and what we're actually receiving. So I talk about this concept fairly frequently. So there's high output with low emotional reward. And then there's low output with high emotional reward. So one of the examples that I like to use for anybody that has children is, extracurricular activity. Let's say baseball for an example. A lot of parents will say, going to my son's baseball game is a high emotional reward. I really enjoy watching him excel at doing X, Y, and Z. It feels good. It is incredibly supportive of him. He's very happy to see me sitting in the stands. So you have to look at the output, right? So the output might be the amount of time you're spending. Well, you're spending 2 hours of time. There's a high emotional reward. So remember the whole, I've got a lot going out, a little coming in. Well, what that's doing is you've got more coming in and it's taking 2 hours of your time. High output, low emotional reward might look like taking a child to a practice. Maybe that's a high emotional reward activity. Maybe it's not. You're not engaging. They don't recognize that you're there. That's another 2 hour, chunk of time where you're sitting there and you're like, this isn't necessarily enjoyable for me, right? So then you've got 2 hours of time going out and you have almost nothing coming in. Another example is laundry. That's high output. That takes a lot of time, and haven't met too many people yet that tell me that they really enjoy doing laundry. So that would be a low emotional reward item. When I look at this concept, it is unique to every individual. Some people, and I mentioned this earlier, some people derive a lot of satisfaction from cooking, so that would be, it could be a high output activity. Maybe you're making that 5-course meal. It could be a low output activity. Maybe you're whipping something up in 20 minutes. But it's about, what is this sense? Like, what are you receiving from doing that? Is there something there that you're enjoying? And if you do enjoy it and you derive satisfaction, then you need to do more of that activity. Other people I talk to hate cooking. It can be high output, low emotional reward. So then you have to look at it and go, okay, well, if I'm not deriving much emotional satisfaction from this, is this an activity that I should delegate out? Should I be getting more Chick-fil-A, right? That would be something that an area of life that you could look at and go, okay, I need to do less of that. So when I have people walk me through their days, I don't have them go over their checklist, right? Typically the checklist is never fully checked off, but it's about redefining how you approach your to-do list. Instead of doing less, it's about how it evolves. So what I want you to think about is, if you have 10 tasks in one day, are out of the 10, do you derive satisfaction from 5 of them? And how is there a possibility to ensure that you're ticking all of those off before you get to kind of the other items on your plate? When there's low emotional reward, can you look at some of the things that you have to do and delegate them out, or can you spend less time on them, right? Because the reality of the situation is we all have to do things that we don't want to do. That is inevitable. But it's about how do you minimize your output for the things that you derive no satisfaction from, to make time for the things that you do. I'll give you one last example before I move on. So one example I often hear about is commuting to and from school. You have children, you got to do drop off and pick up. There are parents that come to me and caregivers that come to me and say, you know what, I really love the 15 to 20 minutes in the car with little Johnny every morning. He tells me about his classmates and, what's going on and his favorite subject. And I just feel like that is bonding time. Again, perfect example of low output with a high emotional reward. Then I have parents who are like, I really need to get to the office, and we sit in silence, and it's 20 minutes of my day that I can't get back. That may be something that you look at and go, okay, well, is there the bus schedule, or can a friend take the child to school? Like, how can you take that time back to take the 20 minutes to put it into something that is more enjoyable? So moving on to the second component of today, dealing with high conflict individuals. One of the things, both of these topics are really two separate presentations, but they also kind of go hand in hand, because what happens is if you have high conflict individuals in your life, which pretty much everybody does, they're going to cause extra stressors that can lead to burnout. So just statistically, and just to define what a high conflict individual is, we normally look at it through the clinical lens of personality disorder. So there is a lot of information out there now, and there's personality disorders are gaining a lot of popularity and traction. I hear about narcissistic personality disorder all the time. And there are a couple other, high conflict personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder as well. But they can cause an incredible amount of stress for individuals that have to navigate them. The percentage of HCPs in our environment is averaged at, like, I think it's about 10 to 15% of the entire population right now is estimated to have a personality disorder. Now, the one thing to note is just because somebody can be labeled as high conflict, which I'll define in a moment, it doesn't necessarily mean they have a personality disorder. Everybody with a personality disorder will be high conflict, but not everybody who is high conflict will have a personality disorder. So high conflict individuals have a pattern of behavior that creates conflict rather than resolving it. And so some of the personality traits of a high conflict individual, the number one above all is the inability to take responsibility for self. So that looks like it is everybody else's fault, including the dogs, other than their own. If they're late, it was the traffic light. If they're behind on deadline, well, their computer broke. If they're late into the office, it was the Starbucks barista's problem. They will not take responsibility for anything. They blame others. That is, again, looking like it's my wife, it's the barista, it's my children, it is the opposing counsel, it is my executive assistant. They can't take responsibility. And so what they do is they go into the victim mentality, where it is very much a woe is me. I have the worst luck. Nobody understands me. People are always trying to take advantage of me. Always statements are really important. That's very standard of individual with high conflict personality. The third component is all or nothing thinking. So that looks like black and white thinking. An individual is all bad or they are all good. They are the most wonderful person they've ever met. They are the worst person they've ever met. There is no gray. Mental wellness is not being happy all the time or joyful all the time. Mental wellness is actually being able to sit in the majority of the gray that we experience as individuals moving through life and not getting into that all or nothing thinking. High conflict individuals, they take everything personally. So that looks like if you have to give feedback on a project or give direction, they're going to take that as a slight. They're going to take it as an insult. It's going to be, you'll hear statements such as, it's always my fault, or I'm just never good enough. I was never a good enough mother for you, or I'm a terrible partner on this project with you. They personalize any kind of feedback to be negative. Another component is lack of self-awareness. So they're just not aware of how they navigate the world and life. They may lack awareness in the way that they communicate with individuals. They may lack awareness of boundaries. I mentioned the boundaries earlier, maybe time boundaries. If you state a boundary and you're like, hey, I'm offline after 5 p.m., they are going to blow right through that boundary and not even notice it, because part of the lack of self-awareness comes from self-centeredness. Other areas of self-awareness is when they are providing feedback or communicating, it can be highly inflammatory. And again, going back to, they end up creating conflict rather than going into looking at, how can we move forward in a healthy and productive way, or how can we resolve something. So what high conflict individuals typically do, they don't think in like the logical, rational, analytical ways of moving forward strategically. So how do you handle them? There are a couple different ways of navigating. If you've identified a high conflict individual, there are a couple different ways of navigating them. So the first thing that you are not going to want to do is to attempt to give them insight into their behavior. So that looks like, hey, I just want to let you know what you said in the meeting today was highly offensive. Or, you really shouldn't have talked to Joan that way. Do you realize that, what you said was offensive? The second that you attempt to give insight into their behavior, you're going to be met with defensiveness, because again, it goes back to low self-awareness. There is nothing wrong with them. There's everything wrong with you. So it is impossible to give critical feedback to a high conflict person and actually have them hear it and use that information to benefit themselves. So what people often try to do is they get into this like coaching model, right? Like, oh, well, if I just allow them to know that if they just tweak this or they just do this, that maybe people won't be so upset with them all the time, or maybe it'll be more solutions focused. But they can't hear it, and it can be incredibly emotionally draining and frustrating for the individual trying to point out, how their behavior is impacting others. Leading with the "you are right" statement. So this is one of my favorite things, and probably one that I get the most pushback on. So if you're in conversation and communicating with somebody that you've been able to identify as high conflict and you want to de-escalate and disarm, one of the quickest ways to do that is to find one nugget of the conversation and the communication that they have accurately stated. So you could be in a 10-minute conversation and they said, the sun is shining today, but then went on to say 5 other things that are incorrect. You can lead with you are right, the sun is shining today, and then actually give a rebuttal, because what that does is it sets the individual up, and this is true whether that person is high conflict or not, but it sets an individual up to be able to hear you with what you have to say next, and they're not going to necessarily be looking to defend their argument or their position. Stay focused on topic. So high conflict individuals are notorious for getting off topic. So that will look like you say, the sun is shining today. And they're like, well, it rained 2 days ago. You're focused on the sun. You're focused on the present moment. They're taking it back to 2 days ago. So in that example, what you would need to do is say, I understand that it rained 2 days ago. I'd like to stay on topic and bring it back, because oftentimes if you're looking to progress a conversation or a relationship with somebody who is an HCP, they take things off topic, and before you realize, you've had no resolution because they're 5 topics later. And working with individuals who are in a partnership or a romantic relationship, this will often happen. So for example, if you're in a romantic partnership with a high conflict individual, it will sound like, hey, I want to let you know that what you said was hurtful, XYZ. And they'll be like, well, what you did last month really hurt my feelings too. That is, it's oftentimes subconscious, but they're manipulating the outcome of the conversation by taking it to a past event. And then at that point, you're on the defense and you're not able to make any kind of forward progress because you're off topic and you're focused on having to defend yourself. Similar to the, attempting to give insight into their behavior is to not give advice. The reason why you don't give advice to HCPs is because they will take it and then they're going to make your advice the problem or the fault. So for example, if you said, you know what, you should really consider doing X, Y, Z on the next project, and then they do it and it's not perfect, they're going to go back and they're going to be like, well, it wasn't perfect because of him or her. So avoiding of advice, again, it really keeps you in an emotionally neutral place where you're just like, I'm going to let them do their thing. Do not lead with apologies. So oftentimes, high conflict individuals are emotional vampires. Like, one of the ways that you can tell that you might be engaging with an HCP is that you leave the conversation just completely drained and exhausted, right? So one of the go-to places is if you are being put on the defense in conversation with an HCP, you want to apologize, you want to make right. But what you need to fully understand is, are you apologizing to further the conversation and to kind of redirect? Do you actually owe the individual an apology? Because that's a whole other topic at hand. But don't say, oh, I'm sorry, just to soften whatever is going on with the HCP. Because what happens is when you lead with oh, I'm sorry, they will take that again as a way to manipulate the outcome and make it your fault. And then there's no way out in a productive way. And then lastly, looking at avoiding, just avoid responding emotionally at all. So one of the things that high conflict people like to do is they engage through that emotional warfare, right? They want you to have a very big emotional response. So sometimes they might bait you into having a reaction, or, like we call being triggered. If you're able to stay logical, rational, and analytical and not give them that emotion, what will happen is the conversation typically stays more neutralized because they don't have a response and reaction from you. So they can't drum up even more conflict and frustration as a whole. One of the communication strategies and the one that I teach the most for dealing with people that you've identified as high conflict is the BIF method. The BIF stands for brief, informative, friendly, and firm. So what most of us try to do is we'll be in conversation and somebody will say something that can put us on the defense, right? And when you're on the defense, oftentimes you want to do one of two things. You either want to attack back, which is normal. It's a normal behavior rooted in neurobiology, or you want to explain. So they're coming at you from, whatever direction, and you're like, let me explain myself. Let me tell you why I did it this way, X, Y, and Z. The reality of the situation, then you've been put into a power dynamic where the high conflict individual has a one-up on you because you're now explaining and defending why you made the decisions that you have, why you executed the way that you did. So if you find yourself in communication, the pattern is to go to keeping it short and simple. If it's in writing, it's a 1 paragraph, 2 to 5 sentences, no more. But the communication can be short and it needs to stay on topic. It doesn't necessarily need to be, a novel about why you did what you did. It's just a couple brief bullet points. And even when you're speaking, you can do the same thing. Informative. I will say this over and over, staying on the subject being discussed, because oftentimes when you're working and navigating high conflict people, they're going to try to take you off topic and off subject, and then you're not going to resolve anything. And one of the quickest ways, again, in communicating verbally or written is, I'd like to keep addressing the topic at hand, or I'd prefer to stay on topic at this point. We can address X down the road. Friendly. You can lead with friendly. If it's in writing, you can also sign off in a friendly way. Part of the reason that it needs to be friendly is because when using the BIF, you're taking out all emotion, right? You're taking out any kind of emotion in dialogue, and you're also doing it in writing as well. So thank you for your email. Let's stay on topic. This is the area of focus, boom, 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 and then in the conversation. Same thing with the communication. You know what? Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I still believe this to be true. I'm not able to address this with you today. And then in the conversation. But BIF is one of the things that is incredibly hard to manage, but what it will do is it will effectively give you a tool to get yourself out of things that can feel emotionally draining or provide mental overload. So that goes back to the burnout component of this presentation, where if you're using BIF and even, talking about my M&Ms analogy, this keeps your M&Ms for you, and then your M&Ms are not going out to the high conflict individual, because they're sitting there and they're saying, hey, I want to invite you to this conflict. I want to sit here and go back and forth on it. I want to drain your energy, so give me all your M&Ms. And this pattern of communication is you creating a boundary and keeping that time and that emotional energy for yourself. That is all I have for you guys for today. I did leave some time for any questions. I know I went through the material pretty quick and it's pretty high level, but if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Jenna. Looking to see if there are any questions open at this time. Nothing has come through on my end. So I will just provide the CLE code as we give the attendees an opportunity to raise any questions they might have. Right, and the CLE code for today is 8204. That is 8204. we have, potential questions from Matthew Parker and Donald Jacobs. Matthew, your hand looks like it came up first, at least on my screen. Are you able to unmute yourself? Whitney, if you would just, oh, here.
I'm sorry, I don't have any questions.
Oh, okay. Your hand was raised. Donald, did you have a question? Your hand is raised. All right. So Donald, are you on? All right. Oh, I see a couple coming through. Jenna, are you able to see those questions coming through?
I am. So I'll start. Yes, Donald asked one, and an anonymous attendee asked one. So I'll read them out loud. I live with what appears to be a high conflict individual. I'm using all the wrong approaches per your slides. Do you have any further suggestions since I live with this person and do love her? That is an excellent question, because oftentimes when we have high conflict individuals in our life, they are people that are the closest to us. You know, it could be a wife, it could be a mother, it could be our best friend. And what we do when we love them is we want to make them feel better. That is a very normal and natural thing to do. But then what happens is it feeds into, somebody who could be potentially looking for conflict. The first thing that I want to address is that if you're in a high conflict relationship or, around a high conflict, it's the person might be looking for connection. You know, I mentioned personality disorders. I really didn't get into them today, but sometimes our default mechanisms as individuals, especially if we have a trauma history or a history of mental illness, will be to connect through conflict. So that's what I say to the anonymous attendee. You might be seeing that this individual is really reaching for you, but they don't have the proper skill set to connect in a healthy manner, right? So they're using conflict. They're creating fights just for connection. So one of the ways, if that's the case, that you could disarm the individual is be like, I see how frustrated you are, lead with empathy. Are you wanting to connect? You can lead with empathy and acknowledge them, because one of the things, whether you're high conflict or an individual who doesn't have a personality disorder, is we all want to feel heard, seen, and understood, right? So leading with the I hear or I see is such a validating experience, whether the person's HCP or not. So that's number one. Number two, if they are creating conflict and there's no way out, that's when the boundaries come in, right? It's hey, I'm going to let's go ahead and end this conversation. We're not making any progress or productivity at this time, but I will come back to you tomorrow to see if we can have the conversation again. That's really important, because again, a lot of HCPs either have a personality disorder, have a trauma history, they have things in their environment that have led to be who they are, right? For the most part, people don't love conflict. So one of the things that you don't want to do is, if you choose to disengage with somebody who's high conflict, you don't want to leave them hanging, because that might trigger abandonment wounds or rejection wounds. So you always want to kind of come back to them and say, hey, right now is not the time, but at 10 tomorrow, why don't we sit down and have a conversation? Okay. The second question, moving on, please describe personality disorders. So I'm going to describe it in a very non-clinical way. So there's mood disorders, which mood disorders are anxiety and depression, right? And then there's personality disorders. So mood disorders are more like the weather, and personality disorders are more like the climate. So if you think about rain, that would be, depression. A lightning storm would be anxiety. But if it's a personality disorder, it's climate, which means if you live in a tropical environment, it's going to be tropical. And in order for it to not be tropical, it's going to take a long time, and it probably will never change, right? Same thing with like maybe a very dry desert. So personality disorders come from a set of characteristics and traits. They normally develop in our developmental years between the ages of 0 and 6, and they are incredibly difficult to non-existent for change. If you have depression, your depression can wax and wane. You can resolve your depression and never have depression again. You know, if you have anxiety, it could be situational. And then as that situation lightens up, it can go away. But a personality disorder, part of it's going to be genetic, and it's going to be a set way of being for a long period of time.
Thank you, Jenna. We have just one more raised hand here. Ellie Foraker Gardner.
Yeah, it's Laura Ann. It's just too long to put in almost anything. So first of all, thank you. This was really timely for a case I'm on that actually does involve both high conflict and personality disorder that's been diagnosed, and actually family. And so we're 3 or 4 years, a little longer than that, really, into this, trying to navigate this in a family trust situation. And we have family members who've been trustees. So what I'm taking away from this, and one of the things that I was noticing, I really like having this framework. We've kind of ended up operating in this framework a lot of the time, this BIF method. But I'm often find myself in the position of reiterating to folks that we just need to, being disengaged does not mean, as long as you're doing what you're supposed to do, engagement is futile on a lot of levels. And, and I just want to double check that. And the personality disorder we're dealing with is the one that was diagnosed as borderline, and it's been in place for decades. And it has really been near to impossible to describe until today, because you've described it for me quite well in seeing all these traits. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts on helping your clients to feel okay about following the disengagement time, like knowing when it's time to limit things and to disengage.
I know. And that's such a great question, because that's something that I have to coach a lot of people on, right? Because when you look at BIF, and I think I said it earlier, it can feel sometimes harsh or mean when somebody's starting to kind of employ these tactics. So one of the things that you want to think about is, one, when it's time to disengage, but that you're not necessarily not being empathetic towards the individual, right? What you're doing is you're sticking to the facts and just supporting them and being like, this is not, while it might be a different way of communicating, what we're starting to do is we're starting to learn how to be more factually based versus emotionally based. Because, and especially if the process, is ongoing with a divorce, what I often see is the person has been emotionally engaged for so long, they don't know how to move out of that. And one of the things that I coach people on is BIF can really be used during the divorce process, but also post-divorce with an ex-spouse, especially if there's co-parenting involved. So it's not necessarily, it's okay to lead with empathy. And if they're feeling like, oh, this is a bit off-putting, you can include statements like, I hear what you're saying, I see what you're saying, but then again, just be very brief and stick with the facts. I don't know if that was helpful, but
that is helpful. The other thing, though, is it's hard to explain to people that if you're being attacked or your things are being said about you that aren't true, it's still better to ignore it than it is to try to refute it or discuss it, because you're not going to change the narrative that that person has. That
Well,
person's narrative is very resistant to change.
yes, and what I like to tell people is that they need that narrative. They need that perception of you so they can behave in the manner that they are. Because if they don't hold that narrative and their perception of you, say making you to be the villain, as truth, then they may have to look at their behaviors themselves. And that goes back to what I was saying is they're without blame. They're the victim. So the second they start taking accountability, like, oof, maybe I shouldn't be saying this, or maybe I can't, attack my spouse or my partner in that way. That's a whole other ballgame. So it's about helping the other client accept what is, which is what I said earlier. It's like the acceptance of what is, and that they're not, no matter what they say and how they explain themselves, it's not going to matter.
So Mike Jorgensen has his hand up, and I just wanted to give him the opportunity for some, if you had a question, Mike, before we close off here. We're past time.
I know, and I'll make it quick, and if it's a long answer, we can definitely postpone it. Because we've talked a lot about disorders and whether they're personality or mood disorders. We run into people that have high conflict situations because of their own choosings. They're drug addicts or they're alcoholics. Do you have any words or pearls of wisdom? What do we do in that situation? If you're married to an alcoholic or a drug addict, you can't just usually walk out on them. Do you have any ideas, or is that too long of an answer?
I mean, that in and of itself, and it's such a great question, Mike, is definitely an entire presentation. Let me think of how to quickly give you some pointers. So healthy detachment to outcome. Typically, we're looking at, like, one book I'll just throw out there is Codependency No More by Melody Beattie for your clients, because when you love somebody who has an active addiction, it feels like betrayal. If you're trying to move away, you feel personal responsibility to care for them. And you can't love somebody out of their addiction. That's just not a possibility, right? So then it's like healthy attachment. And then going back to kind of what I said for the burnout, like creating some boundaries, like an if-then scenario, where you're not going to be able to control their active addiction, but you can control, hey, if you are drunk, I will not have these conversations with you. That's a boundary that you can set. But it normally starts off with, looking at what boundaries need to be established. How can the individual create a healthy attachment or a healthy detachment from the relationship where they're not enabling the behavior, and then focusing on themselves and looking at, is there a pattern of codependency kind of going on in the process as well.
That's helpful, and I know we can do a whole new presentation, and we might invite you back.
I'd be happy to. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you guys today.
Thank you so much.
All right. I know we have a few other questions coming in, but we do have to close the channel here at 1:05, which we are rapidly approaching. I don't know, Jenna, whether you are able to answer that last question in the chat by anonymous attendee. What approach do you recommend in dealing with a person that completely shuts down?
So that one's that one's really difficult, and I will say something. When an individual shuts down, it's called stonewalling, and it's actually a form of emotional abuse, and like that's going to be really difficult for me to get into and explain. But there's really nothing that you can do. It's accepting what is, because if they shut down, it can be a host of reasons. Again, it can be a trauma response to their history. It can be a way of manipulating an outcome so that they're not held personally responsible. But you have to wait it out and let them come to you, unfortunately. But it's not, it is a form of manipulation, and it's, I consider it like kind of a form of emotional violence as well.
Thank you, Jenna. And if there are additional questions, is it okay for people to contact you and reach out?
Of course, I put my email. I'd be happy, like if you guys have any additional questions, feel free to reach out via email and I will try to answer all the questions that come in.
Great. Thank you so much. And that's a wrap. Whitney, if you're still on, we can wrap up the presentation. I just want to thank you one more time, Jenna. This was fabulous. And we all definitely could benefit from hearing this information. So I'm so grateful that you were able to share this with the tax section's CLE. Want to share the code one last time? It's 8204 8204. And thank you. It was a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.